Winter, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes stood cold and silent beneath a blanket of snow. American soldiers believed the war was almost finished. Paris was free, the Allies were pushing east, and everyone thought the German army had nothing left. They were wrong. Deep in those frozen woods, the Wehrmacht gathered for one last desperate strike. Their tanks were fueled, their guns loaded, and their orders simple: break the American line, reach the Moose River, and divide the Allied armies in two. On the morning of December 16, thunder rolled across the fog. German shells screamed through the air, shattering the calm. Within minutes, the quiet sector near the town of St. Vith was on fire. American outposts vanished beneath the first wave of the attack. Soldiers stumbled from their foxholes, dazed, their radios crackling with panic. It was the beginning of what would be called the Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive in the West. At the center of the chaos stood Major General Robert Wainwright, commander of a small American corps guarding that stretch of forest. His orders from above were clear: hold the line. But as reports poured in from every direction, tanks breaking through, units cut off, ammunition running low, he realized something grim. Holding meant dying. His men were being surrounded faster than they could move. Every road east was under German control. Every hill they held was being shelled into dust. Wainwright was no coward. He had fought in North Africa and Sicily, earning a reputation as bold, sometimes reckless, but never afraid. Yet now, watching his maps fill with red arrows, he did something no one expected. He ordered his troops to fall back. To his officers, it sounded insane. Retreat in the face of the enemy? Abandon towns they had bled for? One colonel shouted that it was surrender. Wainwright simply said, "It's not surrender if we make them follow us into hell." His eyes, tired but steady, turned to the west. Pull back. Every man, every gun. We'll draw them in. Through the day and into the freezing night, American convoys snaked down narrow roads, headlights covered, engines growling softly in the snow. German scouts watched from the tree line, confused. The Americans weren't running in panic. They were moving with purpose. Something about it didn't feel right. By dawn the next day, Wainwright's corps had vanished into the mist, leaving behind burning trucks and empty foxholes. The Germans moved in, cheering their easy victory. They didn't know they were driving straight into a trap. The retreat wasn't chaos, it was calculation. Wainwright had chosen his ground carefully. 10 miles behind the original front lay a shallow valley flanked by two ridges, with a frozen river cutting across the center. It was terrain made for defense. There he positioned his artillery, digging the guns into the icy earth. Engineers wired bridges with explosives. Tanks were hidden among the trees, waiting. His men were exhausted, hungry, half frozen, but they trusted their general. He had a plan, even if no one else could see it yet.
By the third day, they reached the valley. From the ridges above, American spotters watched their columns enter the narrow corridor. Hundreds of vehicles stretched for miles. Wainwright gave a single order: wait until the last one's in. The fog lifted for a moment, revealing the German tanks gleaming against the white snow. Then the first American artillery battery opened fire. Shells rained down, tearing through the convoy. Flames shot into the air as fuel trucks exploded one after another. The valley became a furnace. German soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting in confusion. Within minutes, the neat lines of armor dissolved into wreckage. From the hills, American tank destroyers joined in. Their 90mm guns struck like thunderbolts. The Germans tried to turn, but the roads were clogged with burning vehicles. Wainwright watched from his command post, his face hard. He spoke quietly to his radio operator. "Tell them to push now." Infantry that had been hiding in the woods moved forward in waves. Mortar fire burst among the trees as the Americans charged downhill, yelling through the smoke. It wasn't a retreat anymore. It was revenge. German commanders tried to regroup, shouting orders that no one could hear over the roar of the battle. One division after another stumbled into the killing ground. For 2 days, the valley burned. Snow melted into mud, thick with oil and blood. Planes couldn't fly, the weather grounded both sides. Everything depended on the men in that frozen hell. Wainwright never left his post. When ammunition ran low, he ordered captured German shells to be fired back at them. When communications broke, he sent couriers on foot through enemy lines. Every decision was a gamble, every hour a fight to survive. By the 4th day, the German advance was shattered. Their divisions, once proud, iron-strong, were scattered across the woods, leaderless and cut off. Many surrendered in small groups, crawling out from behind wrecked tanks with their hands up. The counterattack had worked. 3 entire divisions had been destroyed, not by overwhelming numbers, but by one man's refusal to fight the way the book said he should. News of Wainwright's mad retreat spread fast through the American lines. Some still called it luck, others called it genius. When higher command finally reached his position, they found a battlefield so littered with wreckage it looked like another planet. An officer asked how he'd known the Germans would follow. Wainwright just shrugged. They always chase what they think is running away. That night, the snow fell quietly again over the Ardennes. The fire still burned in the valley, but the guns were silent. Wainwright walked among the survivors, stopping to speak with the men who had held the ridges. They were too tired to salute, too numb to celebrate. But they knew what they had done. They had turned defeat into victory, fear into fire, retreat into triumph. Far behind the lines, correspondents would later call it one of the most brilliant tactical reversals of the war. But for those who had lived it, it was simpler than that. It was survival. It was the proof that even in the darkest hours of war, courage could take the shape of madness, and that sometimes madness wins. As dawn broke on the 5th day, Wainwright looked across the frozen valley, where smoke still rose from the wrecks of 3 German divisions. He didn't smile, didn't cheer. He simply whispered to himself, "Now they know who was really running." And with that, the man they once called insane became a legend whispered across every campfire on the Western Front. His retreat had saved thousands of lives, stalled the enemy's last great gamble, and helped turn the tide of the war once more in the Allies' favor.
The smoke still hung heavy over the frozen valley where 3 German divisions had met their ruin. The air stank of burning fuel and twisted metal. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, hissing as they touched the wrecks still smoldering in the dark. For the men of General Wainwright's corps, the nightmare wasn't over. The Germans had been stopped, but not defeated everywhere. Their attack stretched across hundreds of miles, and elsewhere the Allies were still reeling. Wainwright knew his success would draw attention. He had disobeyed direct orders. His retreat had saved his men, but on paper it looked like cowardice. Higher command demanded reports. Messages from headquarters kept coming through the radio, some congratulating him, others questioning his sanity. But Wainwright didn't care. The battle wasn't finished, and he wasn't done fighting. While his engineers rebuilt bridges and cleared the roads of wreckage, he ordered his scouts deeper into the forest. They found signs that more German units were moving toward them, trying to regroup. The enemy believed they had faced only a small part of the American force. They were wrong. Wainwright was already planning his next move, one that would push the Germans back even further than before. For the first time in days, the weather cleared. Pale sunlight touched the snow-covered ridges, revealing the scale of the destruction below. Wrecked tanks lay half-buried in ice, their crews frozen beside them. Hundreds of prisoners sat under guard, silent, exhausted, staring into nothing. Many of them couldn't believe they had been beaten by a smaller force. They whispered the same words again and again, "The mad general."
By noon, Wainwright's staff gathered inside a ruined farmhouse that served as his command post. Maps were spread across the table, coffee steaming in tin cups. His officers argued. Some wanted to hold the valley and wait for reinforcements. Others demanded a full withdrawal to the rear lines. Wainwright listened, silent, his finger tracing the thin blue lines that marked rivers and roads. Finally, he spoke. "They think we're spent. That's when we strike." The plan was bold. Some said suicidal. Instead of waiting, Wainwright would push forward at dawn, striking the German flanks while they were reorganizing. His exhausted troops would attack with whatever ammunition they had left, supported by the few tanks that still ran. There would be no time to rest, no waiting for fresh orders. It was another gamble, and everyone knew it. That night the men prepared in silence. Snow fell steadily, covering the tracks of the previous day's battle. Medics worked by lantern light, bandaging wounds, loading stretchers. Mechanics fixed damaged Shermans under tarps, their hands numb from cold. Letters were written by firelight, folded carefully, tucked into pockets that might never be opened again. Wainwright walked among them, saying little. The soldiers respected him now. They had seen his madness turn into victory once, and they were willing to follow him again. When one private asked if they really stood a chance, Wainwright answered quietly, "They think we're retreating. Let's make them right. Straight into their graves." At dawn, the counterstrike began. The American guns opened fire first, shattering the morning calm. Artillery shells screamed over the trees, slamming into German positions along the ridges. Infantry moved out through the snow, rifles clutched tight, breath fogging in the frozen air. Tanks rolled beside them, their tracks grinding over ice and debris. The fog that had favored the Germans days earlier now hid the Americans as they advanced. But this time the Americans were ready. They met the German advance with heavy machine gun fire, mortars covering the field, and the Mad Company gathered behind statues of frozen soldiers, shooting their moli at their German counterparts.
The first German outposts were caught off guard. Sleep-deprived and short on ammunition, they barely had time to return fire before being overrun. The Americans moved fast, capturing villages that had changed hands twice already in the past week. Every hill, every farmhouse became a battlefield. The sound of machine guns echoed through the forests, mingled with the cries of the wounded and the thunder of exploding shells. By midday, the counterattack spread like wildfire. German radio traffic filled with panic. Their commanders couldn't believe it. The same force they thought destroyed was now attacking from two directions, cutting off their retreat routes. Entire battalions became trapped between the Americans and the frozen river. Wainwright's madness was working again. Reports came in from the front lines. Enemy tanks abandoned, bridges blown, prisoners captured by the hundreds. But the cost was terrible. Wainwright's men fought with everything they had left. Many ran out of ammunition and fought with captured German weapons. Medics worked non-stop, carrying the wounded through the snow while shells burst all around them. The general refused to move to safety. He stayed near the front, his jeep parked beside a wrecked farmhouse, radio pressed to his ear, directing the chaos like a conductor in a storm. By evening, the fog returned, swallowing the battlefield. Fires burned in the distance, glowing orange against the gray sky. The Americans had pushed 5 miles forward, but they were exhausted. Food was running out and their supply lines were stretched thin. Still, Wainwright refused to stop. He knew that if the Germans escaped that night, they would regroup and strike again. As darkness fell, he made one final decision. "We'll hold here. No retreat. Not this time." His officers nodded, too tired to argue. They dug in for the night, setting up defenses along the ridgeline overlooking the valley. Snow fell thicker now, blanketing the bodies, covering the scars of the battlefield. Hours passed. Then, just before midnight, the distant sound of engines broke the silence. German armor, what remained of it, was coming back for one last attempt to break through. Searchlights cut through the darkness. Wainwright grabbed his binoculars, scanning the tree line. Through the snow, he saw the silhouettes of tanks moving in formation. This was it. The final push. He ordered his men to hold fire until the enemy was close. The ground shook as the German panzers rolled forward, their guns blazing. The Americans waited, hearts pounding. Then, at Wainwright's signal, every gun on the ridge opened at once. The night exploded into flame. Anti-tank shells streaked through the air, slamming into the lead vehicles. The first two panzers erupted, blocking the road behind them. The rest tried to turn, but the valley was too narrow. It became another trap. Infantry poured out of the woods, desperate to escape the crossfire, only to meet a wall of bullets. The snow turned black with smoke and ash. The German assault collapsed in minutes. By dawn, the valley was silent again, littered with wreckage and men who would never rise. Wainwright stood at the edge of the ridge as the sun broke through the clouds. The snow glittered in the pale light, hiding the horror beneath. His officers gathered beside him, speechless. They had done it. The Germans were in full retreat now, their offensive broken beyond repair. 3 divisions had been destroyed in 4 days. The Battle of the Bulge would rage on elsewhere, but here, in this forgotten corner of Belgium, it was over.
The war moved on. The front line shifted east, the snow of the Ardennes melted, and the thunder of guns rolled closer to Germany. Yet the story of the valley, the place where one American general had turned retreat into victory, refused to fade. Soldiers passing through weeks later still found the burned-out wrecks of German tanks half buried in the mud. Helmets, rifles, and boots lay frozen in time, silent witnesses to the madness that had unfolded there. General Robert Wainwright and his men were finally pulled back to France for rest and refitting. They arrived dirty, hollow-eyed, and thin from weeks of fighting. When they stepped off their trucks, people cheered, but the men barely smiled. They had seen too much. Victory, for them, didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. And for Wainwright, it was not celebration that awaited him, but questions. At headquarters, he was summoned before a panel of senior officers. They demanded explanations. Why had he disobeyed orders to hold his position? Why had he risked his corps in a maneuver that could have wiped them out? His staff stood silently behind him as he faced the men who hadn't been there, the ones who had watched the battle unfold through lines on a map. Wainwright answered calmly, "I saw a trap closing. If we had stayed, they have crushed us. So I opened the trap wider and closed it on them instead." There was a long silence. One general leaned forward and said, "You understand, Major General, that what you did could have cost us the entire front." Wainwright nodded. "Yes, sir. It also saved it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the room broke into quiet applause. The investigation ended. Officially, the report would read, "Enemy offensive repelled through flexible defense and local counterattack." Unofficially, everyone in the army began to call him what the men on the line already did, the Mad General of St. Vith. In the weeks that followed, Wainwright's name spread beyond the battlefield. Correspondents picked up the story. Newspapers called him the man who ran backward to win. One headline read, "Insane retreat becomes the greatest trap of the war." They printed sketches of the valley, maps showing how 3 entire German divisions had been destroyed. Civilians loved it, a tale of courage and cunning in the face of impossible odds. But for Wainwright, the praise felt hollow. He had seen the cost of his decisions lying cold in the snow. He didn't see glory. He saw ghosts. As spring approached, his corps returned to the front for the final push into Germany. The men joked that the general would find another way to go mad, but deep down they trusted him more than anyone. He had proven that sometimes disobedience was the only form of duty. When orders failed, instinct and courage had to take over. In March 1945, they crossed the Rhine under heavy fire. German resistance was collapsing, but it was still deadly. Wainwright led from the front again, riding in a jeep with his driver and a single radio operator. His uniform was worn, his boots caked with mud, but his voice never wavered. He told his men, "Keep moving. We started this fight in the snow, we'll end it in the spring." They advanced through shattered towns and empty villages. The roads were lined with refugees, men, women, and children walking west, fleeing the ruins of the Reich. Sometimes he stopped to give them food from army rations. Sometimes he just looked at them, saying nothing. War had stripped away every illusion. There were no heroes left, only survivors. When the German surrender finally came in May, Wainwright's corps was deep inside Bavaria. The guns fell silent at last. For the first time in years, the general allowed himself to breathe. The men around him cheered, laughed, wept. Some dropped to their knees in the mud. The nightmare was over.
But Wainwright couldn't forget the valley. Even in peace, he saw it when he closed his eyes. The snow, the fire, the faces of the men he couldn't save. He wrote in his field journal, "Victory is not the opposite of loss. It is built from it." In the months after the war, he returned to the United States. Parades were held. Medals were pinned to his chest. He was invited to banquets, to give speeches, to stand on stages beneath banners that read, "Our Hero of the Ardennes." But when asked to speak, he always said the same thing: the only heroes are the men who didn't come home. Despite the honors, part of the army never fully understood him. He didn't fit the textbook. His strategies broke rules, his instincts defied logic. Some officers admired him, others feared him. They called him unpredictable, too independent. Yet even they admitted that in the chaos of war, he had seen clearly what others could not. Years later, historians would study the battle that made him famous. They'd analyze maps, troop movements, and radio logs. They'd call his retreat an accidental masterpiece of mobile defense. They'd compare it to the great tactical reversals in history, Cannae, Austerlitz, El Alamein. But those who were there knew it wasn't accident or theory. It was desperation, courage, and a refusal to die quietly. Wainwright retired a few years after the war. He bought a small farm in Pennsylvania, far from the noise of the world he'd helped save. Neighbors rarely saw him, except on quiet mornings when he walked to town for supplies. Sometimes he stopped to talk with children playing near the road, telling them about snow and courage, and why the hardest part of war wasn't fighting, it was remembering. Every winter he wrote letters to the families of his men, hundreds of them, each one personal, handwritten, describing not how their sons died, but how they lived. He never used the word sacrifice. He preferred duty. To him, sacrifice meant loss. Duty meant choice. In 1952, a military historian visited him for an interview. He found the general sitting by the fireplace, the same steel in his eyes that had once stared down the German army. When asked if he ever regretted that retreat, Wainwright smiled faintly. "No," he said, "the only thing I regret is that we called it a retreat. It was the first step forward." The historian asked what he thought of the nickname that had followed him all his life, the Mad General. Wainwright chuckled softly. "Madness," he said, "is just what they call clarity when they can't see what you see." He died quietly a few years later, in his sleep at the age of 62. No grand funeral, no military parade, just a small ceremony attended by a handful of his old soldiers. They stood in silence as the flag was folded, the bugle played, and the valley of his memory faded into history. One of them placed a single piece of frozen earth from Belgium beside his grave. On the back of his headstone, engraved in simple letters, were the words he had once spoken before the counterattack. "They think we're retreating. Let's make them right." Decades later, long after the noise of war had faded, the valley where it all happened became quiet farmland again. Cows grazed where tanks once burned. Children played near the river that had once run red. But every winter, when snow covered the ground, locals said they could still hear faint echoes across the hills. The distant rumble of engines, the whistle of shells, and the ghostly voice of a general who refused to surrender.